生意気言ってんじゃねえ。いらっしゃい。
取り込み中?
You know, I kind of wonder why that's not brought up more in fanfics for this game. How early in the plot Sae and Ren actually do intersect, at least in the flashback parts. And if you've been catching my eye catches, this is technically the third time they've crossed paths. Even here, Sae is acting off if one is paying attention to the plot arc of the game, unable to refer to the person he knows who tends Shujin by name, who is actually her younger sister Makoto, envious of how easy it was to skirt the law and get such a criminal perpetrator to admit to their crimes when that comes up on Sojiro's TV about Kamoshida. But as said, the distortions of the palace rulers are special cases. Criminal prosecutors like Sae are a necessary part of the system to ensure non-supernatural cases are being handled correctly. And this ends up being part of the problem, but we're not there yet. The point of this intersection is to once more showcase, well, the pointlessness of the framing device of the game. Sae's appearance here hits harder in retrospect because the psychotic breakdowns and mental shutdowns, which she is part of investigating, appear unrelated to the palaces. At first. With the idea brought from it being that this begins the seed of her mistaken assumption that the Phantom Thieves who changed Kamoshida's heart could also be behind these other incidents. As if the thieves were like the web activist group Anonymous, and they're causing civil unrest and harm just to expose what is being overlooked, and their pattern only now evolving to the point of the calling card, instead of the thieves' activities being independent of those behind these other incidents. But yeah, we got a lot of treasure from Kamoshida's palace, which when brought out of the metaverse turned into real objects. Ryuji and An having the bright idea of taking that Olympic medal that was the physical form of the treasure and hawk it, earning 30,000 yen from doing so, which they decide we're going to use to fund a trip to a buffet. Now, I originally had a critique of this as that medal works out as being $260, and I couldn't wrap my head around why it cost that much to go to a buffet. But then I looked up the economics behind buffet restaurants, and why they've been slowly failing the last 3 decades is basically the same as all other food service gigs. People can't afford to go to them due to stagnant wages that don't even pretend to keep up with inflation or cost of living increases. Thus, a $50 to $60 per person buffet, that's actually what it costs to maintain one with decent food and well-paid employees in 2016. Especially as the one they go to is a high-end, rich, catered place. For that point, if patrons can't afford the cover charge due to its higher expense, there's no way they're going to one. And if they don't see enough patrons, a restaurant can't keep opening their doors. Ironically, the entire point of buffets to begin with was to cut the expense of having waitstaff and cooking food to order, but just the sheer wage stagnation has crippled even them. Regardless, the group after their success with Kamoshida, specifically Ryuji and An, are a bit ego-drunk on the positive spotlight this has placed on them, after being persecuted for so long. Especially as there's now a website created specifically to thank the Phantom Thieves for their actions, which was started by Mishima out of his own gratitude. Positive reinforcement is like a drug when you've been without it for so long, though as with our sin discussion last time, overindulgence will get one into nothing but trouble. And that's shown by how the other patrons of the buffet are at best indifferent to what happened and why, despite them being primarily from the upper echelons of society. And that itself is telling for the game's political commentary. And that's often those hoarding all the power and wealth who isolate themselves from the problems of the everyday man that might in fact be causing all of them. And distract others from their role in why things do not get better by throwing to the wolves a scapegoat to direct their attention towards. And that scapegoat at the moment is Kamoshida, thanks to him acting outside of the social contract. Even though under normal non-supernatural circumstances, it would be these same people who would so break the law to the point the victimized wouldn't have any power. After all, remember what I discussed about sexual assault laws in Japan in the last 2 Persona 5 videos? In that specifically the victim has to come forward and make a statement for officers to even begin investigation? How easy do you think that is to silence them when one has money or political power? or get the officers or their bosses to kill the investigation. As it's happened before, we've spent the last decade with prominent politicians in America doing that in plain sight. Thus, in truth, the supernatural perception filter really only gave the common man Kamoshida the same privilege awarded to those that are considered higher on the social ladder, who can bribe and strong-arm others to get their way. And the law was written that way specifically to benefit those parties, instead of allowing a third-party witness to come forward in their stead, or the existence of a true impartial arbitrator. And in doing so, corrupted the very system, so those who are meant to be protected aren't. And before one makes any statements to the contrary, I will inform anyone not in the know that Japan's government is notoriously heavily weighted by traditionalists that, by our perspective of political standards, are heavily conservative right-wing. Such has changed very slowly over time, but they still remain primarily in control. Thus, these individuals represent those that fall on that side of the aisle. And as is the idiom regarding such, conservatism consists of exactly one proposition. To wit, there must be in-groups whom the law protects but does not bind, alongside out-groups whom the law binds but does not protect, with them consequently blocking progress that fixes the problems these special interest groups implicitly caused. Just in the same way, we in America have problems that can be easily solved, but have their solutions blocked, because it is personally advantageous to those resisting change to obstruct the solution, then take credit for fixing it. And that is the group explicitly that stories like this, and characters like this, are calling out and rebelling against. So when put in socio-cultural political context, it becomes extremely stupid to proclaim that specifically, this game has no political message or commentary, when the game hopefully proves itself to be about a political conspiracy, and literally wears its criticism and condemnation of conservative and traditional politics on its sleeve. And that is important context because the high society apathy and elitism is one of the motivators for why the group decides to continue seeking out palaces and distortions and act as phantom thieves, to rebel against this sort of nihilistic selfishness in any way they can, to break the yoke of control over those who just let abusers like Kamoshida happen, and want to bury or make irrelevant the fact that they did. But speaking of those individuals and the greater conspiracy storyline, that's where Makoto comes in. And I have kind of an important question for everyone who criticizes the following parts of the game. Why does everybody keep expecting Makoto to act with knowledge, abilities, and authority that she does not actually have? Makoto Nijima is Sae's younger sister, the student council body president at Shujin, who up to this point has been completely unaware, as most of the student body was, of Kamoshida's abuses. Primarily because on top of her normal duties, she is studying like mad for her college entrance exams, to the point that she was literally unaware of any matter in the school that had not been brought to her attention, and one who is now being called in by Principal Kobayakawa, but not to document on the victim's behalf Kamoshida's abuses, so they may be used against the man in court. No, Kobayakawa intends to relieve the school of any criminal liability by doubling down on actually catching those who exposed the crime, because Kobayakawa cares more about the image of doing something and throwing the blame on those that upset the status quo than actually taking steps to correct the problem. And as shown through Ryuji's Confidant, Kobayakawa does absolutely jack all about seeking to prevent those same abuses from happening again. Now, why did I bring up Makoto when Kobayakawa is himself the problem? Well, 3 reasons, beyond this being the first proper introduction to her after seeing her several times in passing. 1. Kobayakawa is part of the conspiracy plotline. He answers to individuals who are themselves middlemen to one of the chief antagonists of the game, the one that framed Ren and sent him here in the first place. That is why he's not fixing anything, as he's part of what broke things to begin with, that helped Kamoshida's palace to form once the distortion took root in his head. 2. The mastermind is always looking for more members to bring into the fold, and Sae already works for them. Sae is unaware of that, but Sae herself is such a useful pawn to them already with how they've manipulated her envy that they plan to extend a similar offer to Makoto in exchange for rooting out the Phantom Thieves for them. It is blatant bribery and cronyism, but to a kid in high school that needs a college recommendation letter due to how the educational system works over there are those who would not see anything wrong with it until it is too late, as refusing could legitimately destroy her chances at the future she desires, in the same way that Kamoshida was deliberately forcing Anne and his other victims into corners to get from them what he wanted. And third, Persona 5's toxic fandom are idiots, and like to blame Makoto for everything that Kitagawa or his superiors are responsible for, despite everything they condemn Makoto for not being the duties of a student council president in Japan. Like, ignore when you read on TV tropes or see an absurdist anime about them having more power than they do. Their responsibilities involve them planning and coordinating school events, budgeting resources for clubs, and acting as a middleman that bridges student concerns to those who could do something about it as they pass along issues to a student council advisor, who then reports to the vice principal of a school, who then chooses to bring up a matter to the full principal or school board. There are no disciplinary committees. There is no influence over school policy. They can't give you demerits over clothing or refer you to a teacher for punishment if you break a school rule. You're not going to have a spontaneous cat hunt pop up on a school campus. That's not the fucking job. The condemnations of Makoto as fallout of her not doing anything about Kamoshida are consequently ludicrous, as what was she supposed to do, which should not have been done by an actual fucking adult in a proper position of authority in the school. As established in-game, all of the victims were being forced to keep quiet and never reached out to them. And because of the perception filter, Kamoshida's actions were not being seen as wrong to anyone for them to file a complaint. And as established, Kitagawa would have just killed the inquiry and told them it was something like Ryuji's incident to discredit them. And the student council are not even the ones you would report sexual harassment and abuse to. So again, what was she supposed to do? This misconception about what Makoto could have done is all contingent on a scene later where An ridicules her for being a toady to the administrators that enabled Kamoshida, and being worthless with regards to stopping him and helping the victims. But An is the idiot in here, making false assumptions that she could have done something. And it's actually because of the scene that the worst interpretations of a character got started, as it made people make assumptions that Makoto's arc is about how worthless she is, when her usefulness as a person is not a factor at all in her character arc, and is quite offensive to consider someone's merit on the sole grounds of what use they have. As apparently they missed the scene after that where An apologized for being a complete bitch to her in the prior moment, and an idiot atop that for presuming she could have had any sway over such matters as a student instead of actual faculty, as An was projecting her own guilt regarding her role in Shiho's injuries wrongfully onto Makoto. But that is likewise a counterpoint to the guilt Makoto does feel when she learned about what was happening around the school, as Makoto is a very moral and ethical person who believes in fair justice for all as one of the tenets she lives by. As while she had no authority to intervene via her student council duties, she could have done something as a normal student had she just known to get the victims out of harm's way, or possibly called upon her father and sister's police connections to try and get an investigation opened. Except again, due to how sexual harassment and abuse laws in Japan are written, she could not have, as it requires the victim of such come forward on their own independently without coercion. And as for the former, again, this is why I've been stressing so much the effect of the perception filter of the palaces, as she would have, and likely was, just as affected as everyone else to not see Kamoshida's actions as wrong while he was still committing them, and they were within his range of influence. So again, what was she supposed to do. For at every turn, what toxic fans and detractors claim she could have done is not something that was possible for her to do, nor should she be singled out as culpable over any adult whose duty and job it actually was to protect the minors in their care from such abusers. The discourse over Makoto's merit as a character as consequences of this is some of the single most idiotic arguments associated with this game, thanks to the people who don't get that. And I brought this all up as early as I did, as I wanted to get out in front of it. Hell, even here, Kobayakawa is all but demanding Makoto step outside of the office of her duties, explicitly to spy on the student body because of her family's history as members of law enforcement. And Makoto herself wants to eventually become a police commissioner to root out corruption in the system, as her father and sister have. So he keeps trying to frame this as her exercising the skills she is cultivating early in order to sell it as her investigating to see if students were criminally blackmailing the confession out of Kamoshida, alongside this shift in personality being abnormal for him. When in reality, Kobayakawa is doing nothing short of coercion, which is based on a lie that how Kamoshida acted before when he was abusive was supposed to be normal. With the final prod to get her to move being the role her sister has, possibly being negatively affected if she fails him. So yes, he is blackmailing her as well, making the direction of her future entirely contingent on what she does for this man, with what her arc is actually supposed to be, all framed on what price she puts on her sense of justice. More on that next time. But if you're among those that would say, Kobayakawa was not part of the conspiracy, you're taking that out of context. Well, funny story.
先生、私です。お忙しいところ恐れ入ります。例の件で。はい、抜かりはありません。早速調査に。もちろんです。いい結果を。はい、近日中にはお伝えできるかと。それでは失礼いたします。お時間いただきまして誠に。
Seriously, who do you think he was reporting to? Media comprehension! This is not that hard! Granted, it is surprising that it takes as long as it does for Makoto to call us out, as Mishima just straight up announces it at the end of class. For as said, he's behind the fan site, and is ready to help however he can.
鴨志田なんかに利用されて、俺は君にもひどいことをした。そのお詫びってわけじゃないけどさ。俺にできることがあったら何でも言ってくれ。
我は汝、汝は我。汝、ここに新たなるちぎりを得たり。ちぎりはすなわち、囚われを破らんとする反逆の翼なり。我、月のペルソナの生誕に祝福の風を得たり、自由へと至るさらなる力とならん。
Yuki Mishima is voiced in Japan by Daisuke Sakaguchi, better known as Uso Yuin from Gundam Victory, which we will not hold against him because Yoshiyuki Tomino is responsible for everything that is wrong with that series. TomahawkMan.exe from the Rockman.exe anime, at least in the stream seasons onwards, Syllabus from .hack.gu, and Hackmon in anything where that Digimon has appeared. And while not every non-Phantom Thief Confidant has a role subversion part of their casting, there is a bit of one presented with Mishima, as Daisuke Sakaguchi has a tendency to play lawful morality characters as going by the ye olde D&D alignment system, whereas Mishima doesn't quite fit that thanks to the Code Geass parallel to the character. And just to say it up front, not every character has a story XP or equivalent, but the unusual amount of remixes my brain latched onto with those that do is why it's going to be a recurring narrative analysis for these videos. It'd be absurd to say they all do, or that plays a central part in their character arc, as several characters only have tangential reference as it is, versus the more story-essential ones where the parallel is much stronger. Mishima acts as the equivalent to Agent Niberius, aka Rollo Lamperouge, for this cast, characterized by his fanatical devotion to Joker specifically, enabling the Phantom Thieves to act by him stalking back in the shadow unnoticed, and assisting their activities by bringing them the names of people who may have the beginning of a distortion growing in their hearts, which the thieves can take out early before the individual begins to act out or form a palace themselves. More than just the story role, he also acts that in-character role, both Rollo and Mishima being rescued from an abusive situation through kindness, and then them trying to pay that kindness back eventually, leads them off the rails as once they've made the choice to defy their old masters, they don't know what to do with themselves. And because of that, they fall back on old habits that ended up being a detriment to their own goals. In Rollo's case, his selfish desire to always be by Lelouch's side as his brother led him to doing actual tangible harm by isolating him from the people who love Lelouch to the point of wanting to kill or replace them himself, not understanding until too late that love for another is not a finite resource, and his failure to understand that being what begins Lelouch's walk to his own damnation. Mishima, though, is a bit more complicated than that, because his specialty is information gathering and distribution. He finds targets that may have distortions within them for the Phantom Thieves to then investigate whether they actually are forming a palace, or if those individuals are just an asshole. And yes, the game does distinguish between them. There are decent people that can become distorted and form palaces. There are actively malicious people who can have their mouths turned up to 11. And then there are just complete dickbags who are just part of their personality to be awful, and yet have no motivation beyond their spite, so there is no foundation for a palace to form within them. But it is in this distinction that Mishima most struggles, so wanting to make up for his past misdeeds that he just plain overdoes it. So out there looking for targets for the Phantom Thieves to reform, that he begins to see criminality where none exists, and starts to go from informant running a website in gratitude into viewing himself as an arbiter of justice himself, and the Phantom Thieves the ones he himself controls as the tools delivering that justice. And this is, in part, due to the lingering distortion left inside himself that was seeded from Kamoshida's influence, that he would escape being the one punished if he just worked alongside the ones with power. And he's doing that again with the thieves. And thus, he's not reforming, not making up for what he did, and using the work he does with the thieves as an excuse to not change. Thus, in becoming more radical, is in fact in his own way a cry for help, as the distortion he himself is forming is a belief that he was nothing more than a victim, and his actions in assisting Kamoshida were not wrong. And that's the lie. They were wrong. In criminal courts, one just following orders has not been an accepted defense for an illegal action. However, it can be reasoned that one who is coerced into an illegal action cannot be held as accountable as the one who incited it in the first place, as an argument can be made that person would not have done it if it were not for the coercion. That's why you often see criminal defendants make a deal for a lighter or committed sentence if they cooperate with the prosecution, with the contingent part of that being they have to admit and accept that they have done wrong. But even then, that is shown to be part of Mishima's own victim complex, so expecting to be bullied, even now he's still being antagonized by their students, that he wants nothing more than to turn the tables on them, and some part of that knows that is wrong. But in finding himself unable to change, he's doubling down, expecting the Phantom Thieves to come and do it for him, prove the evil in his heart by tearing the distortion out, and after confronting his shadow in the metaverse, we just walk away, not giving Mishima what he wants, as that would only further prove his victim complex. A lot of fans don't get that about this scene, that Mishima is trying to deliberately get his heart changed because he himself thinks he's a bad person, but in doing so it would remove the point of reforming. To take responsibility for what you've done wrong, you have to not just own it, but change. stealing the distortions that form treasures of the heart are the extreme last option for something that cannot be fixed by other means. Either the fully fledged palace rulers, those damaged by the distortions into becoming distorted themselves, or those in the real world who are or could become active threats to others' well-being. It is not a replacement for regular means of punishment or reform, nor should it be. And yet, change is hard, as it's difficult to determine the behaviors that cause your biggest mistakes to correct them without external perspective on them. And that does match with the Moon Arcana he is paired with as well, which when right side up represents danger, darkness, and error, the reversed moon aligned with instability, silence, and deception. Put together, it's a tarot card that can be associated with self-delusion, whether it regards one's purpose or actions, or their own criminality. So Mishima is a character that is making mistakes he doesn't know how to correct, thus keeps working himself into a frenzy that only acts as self-harm. For what Mishima is doing is trying to take the easy way out and get someone to force him to change, to get someone else to fix him. But the easy way is what caused the crimes he feels remorse for in the first place. And that is the self-deception. So even if his distortion was torn out, what would motivate him to reform? And that becomes the sticking point for his Confidant story, talking someone like Mishima down from an edge, to be responsible in their actions through support, but also calling out when they take things too far. To be a guiding hand, not an absolute. Hell, if Code Geass were written to end as a tragedy where the villain wins deliberately, one wonders what might have happened had Lelouch been able to talk Rollo down into actually considering his actions before performing them. But that's a timeline we'll never know. Mishima, however, can be saved by not abandoning him. Him ultimately finding his redemption by saving a classmate from a gang that had been extorting them, and acting himself to take that gang down by recording their actions, which could then be used as evidence against them if they refuse to back off. It's from that act, and his experience with being the victim in those situations, that allows him to center himself correctly to not act out of guilt or revenge, but to help others, in the way he wishes he could have been helped himself. And in truth, that shift in mentality, sometimes that is all the difference one needs to not repeat the mistakes of the past.
俺さ、ずっと変わろうとしてた冴えないいじられ役から必死に世間の注目を浴びるヒーローになろうとしてた。でも君と出会って気づいた。ヒーローは目立ってるやつのことじゃない。誰かのために戦えるやつがヒーローなんだ。勝手に協力者を気取ってたけど、本当に本物になれたんだな。俺は世界にとっていてもいなくても同じ空気、そう諦めてた。確かに俺に世界を変えたりはできないけど、自分を変えることはできるんだ。うつむいて何にもできないってふてくされるか、前を向いて一歩踏み出すか、自分の世界を変えるのは自分の心次第なんだね。また失敗することもあるかもだけど、君がいてくれれば何度でも頑張れるよ。だからさ、こんな俺だけどたまには君も頼ってくれよな。世間が何と言おうと絶対に応援する。君が俺を見捨てなかったようにね。
我は汝、汝は我。汝ここにちぎりを血明の絆へと転生せしめたり、絆は反逆の翼となりて魂のくびきを打ち破らん。今こそ汝、月の究極なる非業に目覚めたり、無尽の力を汝に与えん。
And since this is the first non-party member Confidant we've talked about, no, none of those individuals that fill out the rest of the focused upon Arcana are considered to be the traitor. primarily because by the point they would have any awareness or conclusions drawn about our actions, they're too far down the progression tree of becoming a blood oath to consider betraying us. Mishima's confidants can be completed far earlier than I did it. That was merely the way the guide I was using structured his involvement. Which is kind of strange, as ranking up Mishima's confidants gives all party members significant increases in the ways by which they earn experience. Originally, if a party member isn't active in battle, they don't level up, so you end up needing to regularly rotate party members. But by the end of Mishima's Blood Oath, everyone earns the same experience regardless of where they are. But back to my point, because people, specifically Mishima, Ryuji, and An, keep bringing up the Phantom Thief stuff around school, it puts Makoto on our trail very early. Her consequently dogging us for the next month as she is a good investigator. Albeit with her having terrible stats and stealth to the point it's outright hilarious. Granted, with context that she doesn't want to do this, her being as obvious as she is telling towards her mindset on the whole matter. But the other thing that makes us suspicious is, as showcased before, An's own hostility towards her due to An's mistaken assumption the Phantom then adopted that Makoto had any possibility to intervene against him. As from an objective viewpoint, such an investigation like the one Makoto is being strong-armed into doing would be best served by first questioning Kamoshida's victims and those close to said victims. And since Kamoshida had it out for Ren and Ryuji and was plotting to rape An, it makes sense to start with them to see if they know anything. And An's bitching towards someone uninvolved would put up red flags to any competent investigator, let alone an admitted amateur like Makoto. Seriously, if Naoto were here, at this point in Persona's relative timeline she's still doing casework while in college, and even makes a small dialogue cameo in this game, she'd have these three pinned to a wall within a week. The fact it takes a month for Makoto to do the same, with how obvious An is making them, shows a combination of her inexperience, patience to get something solid, and, again, how she really doesn't want to poke a hornet's nest of public outcry in the first place. This entire conversation, exclude awareness of this group being the Thieves, and they would be acting odd enough to watch. But with Mishima giving us potential targets for those who might be distorted enough to be forming a palace, it's time for Morgana to show off how to actually find their shadows in the metaverse, introducing us to the realm of Mementos. The Freshmaker. That joke would have been better had I been able to get actual rolls of Mentos in hand for it, but they're no longer apparently being sold in my region. I don't know why. Mementos manifests itself within the subway lines of Tokyo, the winding mazes of Japan's railways making for something that is overwhelmingly part of every Japanese citizen's awareness, thus grounding its significant cognitive power, alongside the nature of cognition of the railways being different for everyone that uses them, making it so their layouts shift and change with every visit. Thus it makes sense for someone suffering from a distortion to trap themselves in transit by becoming emotionally lost. And thus those transit lines connecting to a new stop when a palace forms by which to allow shadows to be trapped in and influenced by it, thus making Mementos the Palace of Humanity. Everyone ends up playing parts in it. However, it would just take too long to traverse this ever-shifting dungeon on foot, which is what we have Morgana for.
ついにこれを見せる時が来てしまったな。モルガナ変身。ライダー変身。さあパンサー、レディーファーストだ。
Sue, funny story. Morgana's actress Ikue Otani is actually a Kamen Rider fan. She was 5 when the original series debuted in 1971. While she is most known now for playing Pikachu, Tony Chopper, and Zatch Bell, yes, seriously, she's surprisingly not been cast to do a voice role in any Toku material to date, as far as I'm aware. The closest she's gotten is the spoof series Juni Senshi Bakuretsu Eto Ranger, where she played the character Usagi, or just how Toei has gone about animating Chopper's transformations into his animal point forms.
猫はバスに化けるって認知がなぜだかものすごい広く浸透してんのさ。なんでバス？知らねえ。
Damn you, Hayao Miyazaki! But yeah, driving Morgana in his cat bus form through Mementos to find targets suffering distortions makes things much easier to level grind. Though the Reaper Demon exists here as a super boss representing the eternal stalking presence of death, it's really hard to encounter him unless you're dawdling, which you have no reason to. For thanks to ranking up Ryuji's Confidant, it makes it easy to just ram and insta-kill every opponent's shadow that might be a problem, as long as you're high enough in level. For the game also makes it so any shadow you defeat but don't already have registered in the Persona Compendium ends up being automatically recruited as a Persona as long as Joker has open slots in his summon stock. This is actually how I ended up recruiting the grand majority of my Persona that I didn't get from the DLC or from Persona Fusion, thanks to me having such a hard time with the hold-up mechanic in getting through the dialogue options. Which leaves us in good shape as we find our first target to reform. 4 individuals suffering distortions have been deliberately sealed off from the consciousness that is Mementos, seemingly as if to quarantine the distortion in hopes their sickness would affect others, but still leaving behind a portal for others to enter if they need to. And new to the Persona 5 Royal content is Jose, a supernatural merchant who is seeking to find flowers that grow Mementos from human emotion, which we find naturally just from exploring the floors every time we're here. If we can find him and trade them in, we can get points through which to raid his inventory for special items, including SP restoratives and stat boosting items. If you even give him all you've managed to find, he'll give you a stamp for your efforts, which in turn can modify the experience, item, and monetary gains from fighting shadows in Mementos. Couple that with the capacity to insta-kill shadows brought from ranking up Ryuji's Confidant, and it's ridiculously easy to power level the cast in the metaverse, which makes it worth it to help him in his quest since, well, you're going to be here anyways. Granted, much like the dungeons in Persona 4, you want to make it so every Mementos trip you take is for more than one action. You get targets to destroy distortions throughout the game, either naturally from the cast members hearing about them, as part of ranking up confidants as there are some distorted people harming them, and the last group come from you overhearing them as the protagonist works the various part-time jobs the game permits you to do. If you want to destroy every distortion and save everyone harmed that you can, it is a difficult balancing act. Though we don't have free run of the place just yet to find anyone that might have a distortion, each section of Mementos is sealed off by doorways that can only be undone by rooting awareness of someone deeper and deeper into the collective consciousness of the people. Meaning while the thieves are known to the school, as evidenced earlier, they are being dismissed as having any relevance by normal people. Thus we can't infiltrate any farther to see what's down in the depths of this realm, especially as there's something running subway lines deeper and deeper into Mementos, ferrying the shadows of people who are wandering the realm or were held in palaces. And if we are to find out what, and even find more of the targets on our table, then unfortunately the Phantom Thieves who would work best if they were not known are going to have to become a household name. Which loops us back to the first non-party confidant we can get that I had skipped over.
我は汝、汝は我。汝、ここに新たなるちぎりを得たり。ちぎりはすなわち、囚われを破らんとする反逆の翼なり。我、死神のペルソナの生誕に祝福の風を得たり。自由へと至るさらなる力とならん。
演奏中にも言ったけど、10代のモルモットは貴重でね。私はあなたの受験のためにお薬を提供。代わりにあなたはモルモットになる取引。
新薬絶対に完成させたいの。
Tai Takemi is the hot goth doctor we saw earlier at Sojiro's cafe, her being a disgraced medical practitioner reduced to a small local clinic, which in Japan is a career death sentence due to the financial gains working at and for a larger hospital can bring, as would be seen by anyone who may have watched Japanese medical dramas, or possibly even seen Kamen Rider X-Aid, with the character Taiga Hanaya, Kamen Rider Snipe, being Tai's effective counterpart with his backstory experience mirroring Tai's own, albeit with Taiga having his origins as a radiologist before he was given his black mark. Granted, both draw their own thematic and story trope basis from the 1970s Osamu Tezuka manga Blackjack, with that story being adapted several times into various series and OVAs, which has allowed the character to retain enough awareness in the popular consciousness for XPs like Taiga and Tai to be created, and carry on the thematic motif of a persecuted doctor still choosing to do good despite the adversity they have wrongly been saddled with, which allows her to be one of the few of the side characters that sidesteps my Code Geass parallels thing. Unless one wanted to make them comparable to the scientist cast members Lloyd, Cecile, and Rakshata. And they're a different type of doctor more focused on robotics. But even I'm not going to stretch things that far. As discussed last time, she becomes our primary recovery item supplier, in exchange for the protagonist becoming her own personal guinea pig in a series of medical trials she is working on, as her specialty is pharmaceutical medicine. What got her thrown out of a larger facility with the proper resources needed for her experiments and drug trials, however, is the administrator at her previous hospital rushed one of her drug trials after removing her from control over it, him using it on a sick patient with the associated autoimmune disease before it was ready, and Tai had all the blame placed on her instead because it had been her drug. The fact it wasn't ready yet being obfuscated in the chaos. Tai, as a result, is spiteful towards her former employers, continuing on in her research hoping to make the drug safe and to actually work, which is what Ren is helping her out with, as drugs that target autoimmune diseases can be best tested on those with healthy immune systems to show that it wouldn't just exacerbate the problems. In reality, though, said administrator, a man named Oyamada, sought to steal the results of her research and gain fame from doing it, only for the circumstances to go wrong through his own incompetence, as Tai can doctor circles around him, as evidenced when we see one of his patients who had a severe infectious disease that was misdiagnosed as bronchitis. That little girl would have died if Tai had not intervened. And the thing is, he's never stopped antagonizing her to make her quit doctoring so he can completely claim her research as his own by filing false police reports to get her arrested, even though that itself is a crime. But he comes back into focus as more patients of that hospital start to come explicitly looking for Tai, as the administrator has been causing more and more incidents of medical malpractice, and something is causing them to not report him to get his ass fired, and the circumstances around Tai's termination exposed. And as Oyamada ridicules her in person, he reveals that the patient he used her drug on died, thus justifying her termination and breaking her spirits. But with her being unusually submissive towards his threats, yeah, he has to have distortion planted within him, as Ren's more continued presence destroys his influence over her, but not that of other people, as Oyamada leaks the lie to all her distributors, meaning she can't even get supplies to run her clinic anymore, her revealing in her anguish that she was deeply sick as a child and was saved by new medical research, and was motivated to become a doctor to help people the way she was. And now that's all been stolen from her. And someone destroying another's life? Those are terms by which the Phantom Thieves will intervene, to take it all back.
をつけて。
In his defeat, he reveals that the original patient he claimed died. Yeah, she wasn't dead. She just changed hospitals and Oyamada's influence convinced others to jump on his lie. With the destruction of his distortion bringing this all out, that he's a straight incompetent given his position through political connections. Gee, I wonder with whom? And him surrendering to justice returns the light to Tai's eyes. Her regaining her determination to finish the drug with Ren's help to save the original patients. And from such succeeding, we gain her blood oath.
素晴らしいモルモット。いえ、協力者だったよ。改めてお礼を言わせてもらう。ところで、私の方はどう？あなたの役に立ってるのかな？例えば、怪盗の仕事とか。それで、あの代わりを。まさに怪盗の事件と一緒じゃない。あの状況、あのタイミング。正体はあなただと思っても仕方ないでしょ。まあ、どうでもいいよ。問題はあなたがいなければ私は私の使命を果たせなかったこと。新薬も完成できないまま医局長に言われた嘘に騙されたままで、それにこの町の患者たちにも出会えなかった。きっと怪盗団って医者みたいに弱ってる人を救ってるんでしょ。じゃあ私もあなたのために危ない橋を渡ってみようかな。もっとすごい薬用意してあげる。あなたなら正しく使ってくれるって信じてるからね。
我は汝、汝は我。汝ここにちぎりを血明の絆へと転生せしめたり。絆は反逆の翼となりて魂のくびきを打ち破らん。今こそ汝、死神の究極なる非王に目覚めたり。無尽の力を汝に与えん。
The Death Arcana represents the concepts of change in its various states of being, that including death as a change from alive to deceased. Its conception that it's a bringer of death is frequently mistaken, as change is not all bad. It is the end of one thing and the beginning of another. In reverse, it represents stagnation, lethargy, and the loss of hope, the failure of change coming to take away things that were bad, leaving one to wallow in naught but pain, which we see Tai on the verge of when Oyamada lies about their patients, to once again reinforce how the distortions risk bringing out the worst in everyone, and creating new distortions as consequence. As for Tai's capacity as a paramour, honestly of the adults, Tai would be the one I'd most be interested in dating. Though it's in part because, well, hot goth chick, which actually reminded me a lot of a pair of girls I had crushes on in high school. Plus, she's a doctor!
A doctor, honey.
And admittedly, I don't like visiting doctors often. Seriously, I don't even have a regular physician I see, and the last 3 times I've tried to obtain one, I only saw them once each before their entire offices shut down. It's weird. But yeah, she has a good morbid sense of humor, she has a good give-and-take dynamic with Ren that, to me, made her a highlight of the secondary characters. Regardless, the first time we come down here, it is to deal with a guy who's been stalking a woman he's shown interest in, but is only acting to scare off with his creepy behavior. Under normal circumstances, this would just take talking to someone to stop, but as explained, distortions psychologically proof the bearer against the possibility they are mistaken. That's why the Phantom Thieves' intervention is required to begin with, especially in a case like this, before things would escalate. For in this circumstance, removing the distortion would be a preventative act, but also a sign of how these smaller individuals became distorted to begin with. As his distortion is based around this man, Nakanohara, just wanting something in his life that was his, that he could control. Being afraid he's been rejected and abandoned again after having been robbed of everything he had by a man he trusted named Madarame, such being the act that triggered his own distortion. And this first puts us on Madarame's trail, as Nakanohara asks us after we fight him, and he acknowledges he was going too far to help save someone who is suffering under the other man he speaks of, in the same way Nakanohara was himself victimized. Only this younger man cannot see it. For Madarame is the bearer of a full-on manifested palace himself, and thus is exploiting the full-on perception filter effects. This event for me evidenced how the palaces are not naturally occurring. They're triggered by other individuals, which then cause a knock-on effect to spread the distortions further and further, acting like a malignant infection. If this was a natural occurring event, then humanity and human consciousness would not have so few, to the point of being non-existent, psychological defenses against being affected by them. Moreover, the way in which they spread, they reminded me of Persona's wildcards, in that a special person can awaken greater power in an individual by their interaction with them that can allow them to become their best self. And consequently, this is showing the reverse. The individual who triggered a palace to be born made someone into their worst self, and that karmic black hole does nothing more than infect others with malice by proxy in order to escape them. As is revealed over the course of the next plot arc, Madarame is a famous, nay, the most famous traditional Japanese painter in this setting, having gained fame and renown by being able to fluidly reinvent his entire artistic style every few years. But that is all a lie. What Madarame actually does, as is revealed over the course of the investigation, as well as by Nakanohara after his reformation, is steal from the students he takes under his wing, and publishes their work as his own, allowing him to sell these works for exorbitant prices due to it being part of the Madarame brand he is exalted and praised for, which he just soaks up. But in doing so, he robs the opportunity for those artists he steals from to be able to gain recognition at all, or even earn money from their works by which to live, and become independent of Madarame, as if they'd even try to, they'd be seen as nothing but a copycat ripping off the works of a household name, which has led some of them to commit suicide by their inability to tell others of what Madarame did. After all, why would they believe some no-name newbie would be behind the works of someone who has reinvented what it means to be an artist? Yeah, depending on how long one's been watching my show, I've kind of been calling this out in my own way for years, but more in the context of directors and writers, where a lot of the time, directors on a film, TV, or game are given all of the credit that should belong to the writer of a work, and what the writer did and brought to the table to take what ideas a director may or may not have had and turn them into something that would work. The writer did the heavy lifting on crafting the story, which was then the director's job to visually depict. While depiction of a story can also be a large part of what makes a narrative be successfully presented to the audience, if it starts out as a bad story or is made so by outside intervention, they can have the most beautiful looking cinematography ever, and you'll still have a piece of crap people disliked. And yet consistently, the head director is given the credit for everything anyone else that wasn't them was responsible for. That is wrong. And while that is a different medium than just painting, it is still a matter of artistic expression not being credited to the correct individuals, and thus enabling industry-wide abuse of key members of it. Such reaching its head last year with 2023's Writers Guild strike. Granted, we're not allowed to get to that immediately. None of the assembled have much of an idea about the art world to even get close, beyond announcement of an entire Madarame exhibit being opened as one grand Vanity piece to the man, which is what set Nakanohara off to begin with. Our primary delay coming in the form of amicable conversations with Makoto. At this time, she really is not targeting us when one puts her statements in context to her as a person. And really, half the time we end up encountering her for the next month, she's privately confiding in and complaining to us about having to do this when her personal morals conflict with the principal's demands. Though atop that is, in the Persona 5 Royal content at least, us meeting with this Sosuke Aizen-looking bastard, the trauma counselor Takuto Maruki, who is hired by Shujin to help any of the students abused or affected by Kamoshida's actions move past what was done to them and obtain closure. Kobayakawa hoping from the therapy that the kid's parents won't sue his ass for the dereliction of duty he is oh so guilty of. Though Kobayakawa chose wrongly, as Maruki is kind of terrible at his job, more doing it because, well, he was already on campus helping out another student, the young woman named Yoshizawa, who we met earlier, cope with the consequences of her own loss unrelated to Kamoshida. Thus, since he was already going to be around, Kobaya saw him as suitable to hire for this broader task, with us even forming a confident bond with him as he helps Ren dive more deeply into psychological concepts that play part in the cast gaining a greater understanding of the rules by which the metaverse and cognition is governed. I'm actually going to hold off on talking about Maruki's Confidant until I get into Royals after the story ends content, as it's more fitting to talk about it then as one cohesive diatribe instead of sectioning it off. I can't exactly do the same with Sumi, as her relevance to the changed narrative of Royal is a bit more relevant to discuss before, but suffice to say, Maruki's Confidant is one you have to complete in order to unlock the new content of the game when you're playing Royal. It's not the highest of priorities over others, but it's best to be done before the end of November, as he stops being available at that point so he won't conflict with the major story events that trigger late in that month and run through December. And of course, there's just normal exams atop that because of Persona's Japanese student life simulator's traits, with An repeatedly feeling like someone is stalking her. I think part of the problem with people taking the wrong ideas about Makoto as well is having those two meeting scenes on back-to-back days, it giving players the wrong idea that Makoto is stalking them now thanks to An. She is in fact not. An is instead being stalked by the next major character introduced. Said character being Yusuke Kitagawa, who happens to be our in with Madarame as the corrupt artist's current apprentice, having been raised by the man since childhood after his mother's death. But being raised by Madarame seems to have not been the best thing for him, as he is the game's cloud cuckoo lander with just how out of touch with everything and everyone around him he is. Madarame stunted his emotional growth something fierce and caused him to lack life experience by just locking him up to learn how to be an artist. Except the problem with this is nearly all forms of expression is consequence of life experiences, not just training. Case in point, I'm actually really good at building things from scratch, such coming from my lifelong experience building stuff with Legos, Connect sets, or just normal model kits. My dad encouraged I develop this hobby because he is a design engineer, a really talented one. The only reason I didn't follow his career path as well is, well, I sucked at computer-aided design when I was younger. Even now, I need what I'm building in front of me to really wrap my head around it. But by contrast, when I showed him the home improvements I've been doing, and how much better they were over what was there before, as the previous owners of my home were DIY dumbasses, he admitted he would not have been able to do anywhere near as well a job attempting to do the same. But hey, I've got a 3D printer now, so I've been asking him for design advice considering I'm trying to make my own model kit parts now. And I can't exactly sculpt every part I want out of thermoplastics and model clay. And this is part of the problem with Yusuke. He has no real-world life skills nor experiences outside of classes to really bring in as inspirational direction to his art. Thus can only work off base beauty. And thus why he came on to An. I mean, she is a model, so this isn't that unusual. It's just the way he came at her that shows his explicit lack of social skills. Seriously, he's worse than Futaba, and Futaba is a hikikomori NEET. Though again, that's Madarame's fault as he raised Yusuke to lack them, and is even here showing he keeps Yusuke on a pretty short leash. That fellow teen offering tickets to Madarame's exhibition to show that he's on the level. Thus, entirely by chance, which even in Sae's cutaway outside of the flashback in the story's framing device she says is ludicrous, yeah, not the best idea to be admitting that the entire next section of the game is straight up prot railroading riders. But from them, we are given all we need to be able to judge whether Madarame is as distorted as Nakanohara claimed, assisted by Nakanohara posting on the Thieves fan site about his actions. We bring this to Yusuke, but again, it's the problem of the perception filter that when you are in closest proximity to a palace bearer, you are most affected by the perception filter insulating their actions from you. Also not helped that Yusuke does owe his life to the man, and the escalation of Madarame's misconduct is only a recent change in the last couple years. So even without the filter, it's easier to overlook by someone who has a legitimate bias. Granted, Madarame's done a better job trying to cover up his actions, as any form of scandal he couldn't discredit would harm his image as a cultured artist, even shutting down Yusuke's defense as not wanting to have such an aggressive pet. Yusuke admitting a lot of his admiration comes from his greatest inspiration, Madarame's painting Sayuri, and the mystery of the smile of the woman within it that has been the speculation of many art critics, and understanding that has become Yusuke's obsession. But him trying to learn from it has stalled simply because the original was declared stolen years ago, with only pictures taken of it beforehand remaining. As we were informed by this reporter lady named Oya, when she also comes by Madarame's place looking to learn about the allegations of abuse herself. We will be getting to Oya much later. As for the Sayuri, well, I'm no fine art critic, but from having watched several thousand hours of live-action works that are dependent on body language to sell their depiction, well, mimic that pose yourself. And where the painting is deliberately obfuscated, and the posture indicates that she is smiling down at something held in her arms. Most likely, her child. And yes, I guessed this before that is later revealed to be exactly the case. This is not a critique of the painting. It makes sense for the story for it to be so. But not for cultured, experienced art critics to miss something that obvious for so long, as such obliviousness to the obvious predates Madarame forming a palace or gaining access to its perception filter effects. But I think that's part of the point. On some level, despite the perception filter, Yusuke does know the truth, but won't let himself admit it due to what he owes Madarame, as one painting unliked from the exhibit is later revealed to be Yusuke's, and is an expression of his frustration that he can't consciously speak out against him. But he's basically the man's son. Of course he's going to be loyal to him. Defaming his image would be nothing more than spitting in the face of a man who gave him everything, when he was abandoned with nothing in infancy. But much like with the original Kamoshida discussion, the metanap picked up everything they talked about, and Madarame has a hit as bearing a palace. We enter it and find the walls all lined with the paintings of his former students, literally putting them all on display as a sign of how he views them all as his works of art. Thus, his distortion has made him think that anything derived from them is a reflection of his own artistic merits. It's only recently he's actually devolved into straight-up plagiarizing every student he's ever had as gratitude for his training.
彼らはマダラメ館長様が私費を投じて作り上げた作品群である。彼らは自身のあらゆる着想とイマジネーションを生涯館長様に捧げ続けなければならない。それが叶わぬ者に生きる価値なし。
Yeah, that line is supposed to be, must offer the work of their imaginations. As I've said, if you have the Japanese audio on with this game, there are numerous points which expose how divergent the English localization can be. Anyone can have an idea, regardless of its relevancy to a goal or situation. And ideas cannot be copywritten or plagiarized. They can be stolen, but it is what you do with an idea, how you develop it, how you use one's imagination to create something from an idea, which then has artistic merit, which is the subject of Madarame's criminality. Multiple people can take an idea and develop it in wholly unique ways. But what is not accepted is taking not just the idea, but the beats and direction and the actual effort put into the work wholesale. Thus, the English localization is legitimately wrong, as it's working off of a completely different foundation as its concept, despite the Japanese script using an English word to describe it, which thus made it not need to be changed when the dialogue was translated, as the use of an English word there directly means that English word's presence should be maintained. Hell, I just gave an example of how you retain the concept properly at the top of this paragraph. With awareness of this, the group first tries to truly get through to Yusuke, only to hit a wall as he's been so indoctrinated throughout his life, he's just offering himself straight up to Madarame freely. But his inability to work any further on new works of art is his own mind and creativity rebelling against it. It's entirely possible that his subconscious yearning to break free is what drew him to this group like a moth to a flame, due to the awakening of their persona, making them passively immune to indoctrination. But conscious Yusuke is so desperate he's not thinking straight, as in a private place like this, when no one is around, it's pretty easy to deny one basic needs, such as food. And yes, Madarame is starving Yusuke as a means of control. This is revealed later that he frames such as not having the money we need to survive if you don't help me bring more art into the world. It is quite despicable. And in his desperation, Yusuke escalates his request by asking An to be part of a nude modeling session. Well, glad Yusuke admitted to having no sexual attraction to An in dialogue before this, as that sure ramped up the uncomfortable factor. Though at least he tried to be respectful and attempted to draw her with clothes on first, but that didn't really prove his talents and professionalism to them very well. Hell, if they were going to concede to such at any point, well, An does have an out for that, so she wouldn't be fully nude, that she should know about. There are skin-toned undergarments made explicitly for models and actors that allow one the appearance of nudity without requiring them to actually strip completely bare, so they retain their modesty in such circumstances if they are not comfortable being naked. An has every right to know about such due to her being a model, and after the mess with Kamoshida, An has more than every right to demand such a compromise to get her to agree. An does not ever bring these up as an option. That she doesn't is another example for why I consider her dumber than Ryuji is accused of being. For at least when with Ryuji, it always pertains to things he doesn't know jack about, as opposed to one he has every reason to. Granted, that might have been done for the purpose of rule of funny, as An is forced to agree to the terms. Why? Well, Madarame's palace, thanks to it being a reflection of his ego and how fragile it is due to it all being held together by fragile lies, has a lot more security than Kamoshida's did. Madarame's palace has a sealed door, which is contingent on his cognition of him controlling every facet of his domain. In specific, the door to his personal storage room, behind which in the real world is all the evidence one could want against him. As long as he believes no one could enter, the equivalent door in his palace will not open. Thus, An agreeing to model nude for Yusuke is the cover by which to allow Morgana to try and crack the lock. Once he's aware that his sanctum is no longer secure, the cognitive door will open on its own. Unfortunately, even with An stalling Yusuke by wearing a ridiculous volume of extra clothing layers, how many of those clothes do you think she ruined by stretching them all out like that? Things do not go to plan. Morgana having difficulty with the lock, so by the time Madarame gets back, he's only just got inside, leaning on to improvise, which she does not do well, walking straight into his sanctum to show that Madarame's crimes go far deeper than plagiarizing his students. Oh no, he is creating counterfeit versions of the Sayuri, having made up the tale of it being stolen, and then claiming he found the real one as bait to then sell off the fakes to unsuspecting art collectors in order to make a mint. And their silence ensured by, if they announce they have the Sayuri, Madarame can claim they were the actual thief, even though the other people Madarame sold the fakes to would know theirs is a fake as well, it being only how such a scenario would look from the outside and humiliate those scammed that would prevent the rest from coming forward. The image, unironically, is all that matters to any of them, which is how Madarame has been able to get away with what he's been doing. Well, then Madarame has a broker he works through to ensure these deals are made as quietly as possible, the special connection he mentions in the story, through which he is connected to the conspiracy plotline. A lot of people miss the importance of this line, for while the entire Madarame storyline appears disconnected, it's merely a matter of 6 degrees of separation where it's bridged by the middlemen enabling the malice. But as An catches on to, the only way Madarame would be able to recreate all the counterfeit Sayuris is if his version of the original was a fake as well, or as is revealed, very heavily altered, as even that version of it was not Madarame's, as it's found in this room as well. Yusuke recognizing the emotion put into every stroke that is not seen in the Forgeries. The original has a different technique than the Forgeries bear as part of them. This is enough of a shock to break Yusuke's blind faith in the man, but not yet the loyalty, Madarame calling his private security on them, forcing An to drag Yusuke along into the metaverse in order to escape lest they be arrested, allowing Yusuke to hear the truth from the man's own shadow, that every single thing about Madarame is a vain forgery constructed to portray him as a genius, while he feeds on the suffering of those enthralled by him.
絵の価値など所詮は思い込み、ならばこれも正当な経済行為だ。まあ、ガキには想像できんだろうがな。
さっきから金金金。道理でこんな気持ち悪い美術館ができるわけだぜ。
てか、あんた芸術家なんでしょ？盗作とか恥ずかしくないわけ？
芸術など道具に過ぎぬわ。金と名声のためのな。お前にも稼がせてもらったぞ、ユウスケ。
なら、あなたの才能を信じている者は、天才画家と信じてきた人々は、
これだけは言っておいてやる、ユウスケ。この世界でやっていきたいのなら、私に歯向かわぬことだ。私に意を挟まれて出世できると思うか？有能な弟子を集め着想を吸い上げれば才能ある目障りな新芽も摘み取れる。着想をいただくなら大人よりも言い返せん子供の将来を奪った方が楽だ。家畜は毛皮も肉も剥ぎ取って殺すだろうが同じだ、バカ者め。
許せ。許すものか。お前が誰だろうと。
ようやっと目が覚めたかい。真実から目を背ける貴様こそが何より無様なまがいも。たった今決別するのだな。いざや契約ここに結ばん。我は汝、汝は我。人世の美醜の誠のいろは。今度は貴様が教えてやるがいい。
来たれよ、五右衛門。
まがいものとて
こうも並べば相関至極。悪の花は栄えども、醜悪、俗悪は滅びる定め。貴様を親と慕った子供たち、将来を預けた弟子たち、一体何を踏みにじってきた。いくつの夢を金で売った。俺は貴様を絶対に許さない。
Yusuke joins the Phantom Thieves as our mixed ice and physical attacker, not being as much of a glass cannon as Ryuji, but basically being the same mix of skills. His persona Goemon being based around the historical thief of the same name, Goemon Ishikawa. Most people are likely to know of the man the persona is based on, amusingly enough, through his fictional descendants, Goemon Ishikawa the 13th from the Lupin III franchise. That Goemon draws upon many of the original's leitmotifs, but there is problems with claiming he is a descendant in the first place. That being that the original Goemon's entire family was executed after he attempted to assassinate Japanese warlord Hideyoshi Toyotomi, who Goemon viewed as a despot that did nothing but seize power gathered by Hideyoshi's deceased former master, Nobunaga Oda. Whether he was right or not, the original Goemon had a reason to have that perspective, as Goemon's parents had been killed by the previous shogunate without cause, and had such an animosity for the Japanese noble caste grow from this injustice that he became a bandit explicitly to steal back riches from the wealthy to distribute to the public, and in doing so, act to break their hold on them. During the Sengoku era, where Japan suffered through several civil wars, ultimately leading to the nation's restructuring and unification, Goemon was seen as an anti-authoritarian folk hero fighting for the well-being of the people. He was viewed as a real-life Robin Hood, despite his exploits featuring great exaggeration of his skills and abilities, and some of them being entirely misattributed to him to the point we'll never know where the line between the fact of the man and the fiction began. And why it makes even more sense to become Yusuke's persona is one other facet, as it's not just Yusuke's rage on what he came to value all being based on a lie, but how he even got there in the first place. Also, the reason why Yusuke's powers are ice-themed despite fox spirits, or rather kitsune, commonly being connected with fire, does have to do with Goemon as well, as Goemon and his family were executed by being boiled alive, the man saving his son from the pain of a slow, agonizing death from the blisters, boils, and burns by acting to drown his son himself. Thus, thematically, it makes sense to have both fire as a weakness and act to cast ice to counteract the heat that brought his ultimate end. With Yusuke suffering post-awakening exhaustion, he's bombarded by all the things the perception filter and his own bias towards Madarame would just not let him admit, fully on board stopping his former teacher, with a deadline set of not just the end of the art exhibit, but before Madarame can forge evidence against this group, including Yusuke, for learning his secrets, all in order to discredit them, in the same way he's done before to his other former students. And again, in the same way Kamoshida gained power over others by being an upstanding member of the public. It best being done before the exhibit ends as well, because it will allow everyone to see on every wall of the museum it's staged in the complete truth of his fabrication once context to all his art is given. And with all the prep work already out of the way, and the Confidant ranks that are available already progressing, I get the infiltration done and calling cards sent out literally 5 game days later. It's really the contrast with Kamoshida's Palace, which took forever with all the back and forth for story nonsense, to realize just how much less time is spent in the game on this second and subsequent months. The end of Kamoshida's story to the end of Madarame's only taking another 10 hours of game time. And even then, all that time isn't spent explicitly on Madarame himself, but the other developmental activities of the ongoing story. Now admittedly, Yukiko's dungeon in Persona 4 had that same problem, and there's a legitimate perspective that the extended length of Kamoshida's Palace was all based upon it being the foundation for everything else. So it needed to just do so much that it took far more time, and that is fair. That justifies its length to me. But for others, well, a lot of people foolishly drop the game in the middle of it. Hell, I was sold on the game back when I first played the original version in 2017, but I was just so busy at the time, it took me until Royal release to get back to it. And even then, that was during the pandemic when I was working 60-hour weeks, so it took me a couple years after that. But yeah, what I end up liking so much about Madarame's Palace in turn is it does build off of all the mechanics introduced before, while giving us new complications such as the various security systems featured in here, and even a new type of enemy to confront now, known as a treasure demon, a special type of shadow that only appears once each palace, so you need to recruit it, and doing so gives a whole host of rewards through either itemization or the ability to upgrade persona heavily when used as a fusion material. The security puzzles, though, I did like, as while they weren't hard, they did vary up just traveling and fighting shadows and dealing with environmental obstacles. Though I am a complete sucker for some of the surrealist things made use of in Madarame's Palace, such as when we need to go inside a painting as if it was a Looney Tunes bit. And then there's just this grand fun of spoofing MC Escher that I can't help but smile at. Hell, Ryuji shows how he learned from his experiences, as when we finally reach the treasure room, Ryuji suggests we look around and find a different way to claim what manifests as Madarame's distorted treasure, so as to avoid the problem they had with claiming Kamoshida's, us finding not just a way to shut off the metaversal security around it, but ways to just claim it directly from amidst their security. With that prepared, Yusuke is commissioned to design a proper calling card for Madarame, Ryuji formalizing his speech much more with Yusuke's assistance, and pissing off both man and shadow in the process. Thus, when we return to the Museum of Vanity, we claim the treasure, only for there to be one problem even with our plan.
It's a fake.
I mean, why do we expect for the real treasure to be in the most guarded place? Madarame's Vanity is smarter than that. Of course it would be a feint. So despite trying to avoid this confrontation, it's made clear from this encounter that anytime we try to claim the treasure formed through distortion, it is going to devolve to a fight with the palace ruler. Shadow Madarame revealing that the Sayuri was actually the work of Yusuke's mother, and originally depicted her love of him. A lasting epitaph of it, even as she herself fell ill, as Madarame worked her to death. As after Yusuke's father died, she fell into Madarame's orbit, her being the first one he profited off the work of. This being the true reason why Madarame took him in, to be that very same sort of cash cow in the event his mother's talents were passed on to him. But he never truly cared for any of them, or their well-being. For if he did, he wouldn't have just stood there, doing nothing, as Yusuke's mother died from a seizure she could have been treated for.
母親譲りのガサイは嬉しい誤算だったがな。着想をいただくなら大人よりも言い返せん子供の将来を奪った方が楽だ。お前のおかげで思いついたんだ。感謝しとるよ。
ユウスケ、
礼を言うぞ、マタラメ。お前を許してやる理由がたった今全て露と消えた。貴様は腐った芸術家じゃない。芸術家の皮をかぶった世にも卑しい悪鬼外道だ。
And now it's time for Yusuke to steal back his life and his mother's living legacy from the demon of vanity that is Azazel. Well, okay, looking it up, Azazel isn't a demon of vanity. They are a demon of the deserts, and his myth is in fact where the term scapegoat comes from. Azazel, in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic religion, was viewed as a fallen angel cast down from the heavens, who gifted humanity with forbidden knowledge and original sin. During Yom Kippur, 2 goats would be sacrificed during a ritual, one to Yahweh, representing the people's faith, and one sacrificed to Azazel representing the sins humanity bears and wishes to rid themselves of. This in context of Madarame's actions, his students are the scapegoats he'd sacrificed to the altar of his own vanity. And appropriately, all of Madarame's Azazel forms in this battle are differing expressions of forgery. First a collection of paintings he hides within, and then a collection of elementally aligned forgeries. Initially, the second set in the battle is the more problematic one, as depending on the rotation of them, you would only be able to take down 2 at most. But as the rounds proceed and we defeat the fake Madarames, he begins to make his forgeries more diverse, which then allows us to hit their individual elemental weaknesses all in the same single turn, thanks to Persona 5's baton pass mechanic, thus making the diversification his ultimate weakness, with Yusuke rightfully being the one to deal the final blow.
Persona!
お前はもう終わりだ。このおぞましい世界と共にな。
助けてくれ。命だけは、命だけは。
現実の自分に帰ってこれまでの罪を告白しろ。全てだ。
殺さんのか。
約束しろ。
分かったから。あやつは来ないのか。あの黒い仮面の。
The who now?
まさかパレスに我が輩たち以外の侵入者がいたってのか？
Well, no. Madarame doesn't get a chance to expand on that, but this black mask guy, they weren't at Madarame's palace. They are the ones Madarame encountered who triggered his palace to form in the first place. Shadow Madarame just brought them up because he remembers that, and our powers are similar to theirs.
なあ、ユウスケ、わしはどうしたら。なあ。
優秀の美くらい、せめて自分の作品で飾れ。
ユウスケ！
おい、待ってくれ。なあ、ユウスケ、ユウスケ。
さようなら、先生。
我は汝、汝は我。汝、ここに新たなるちぎりを得たり。ちぎりはすなわち、囚われを破らんとする反逆の翼なり。我、皇帝のペルソナの生誕に祝福の風を得たり。自由へと至るさらなる力とならん。
Yusuke as a character is the Jeremiah Gottwald of our cast, bearing fanatical devotion to a person and an ideal above all others, whom are undeserving of that loyalty, who then break from it in favor of the protagonist of the story. There are of course significant differences in presentation, to the point it took until I was writing this script and ruminating over who it could be, or if Yusuke was without a parallel for me to bring up. But it is Yusuke's fanatical devotion to the Sayuri, his mother's last gift, that made such click for me as comparable, if certainly not the same. His Japanese voice actor is the famous, infamous, and ubiquitous Tomokazu Sugita, best known as Kion from Haruhi Suzumiya, Gintoki Sakata in Gintama, Joseph Joestar in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, the Mad Dr. Ver in Symphogear, Escanor in The Seven Deadly Sins, the entire Kivat race in Kamen Rider Kiva, King Oladin and the Kirame equipment in Machine Sentai Kira Major, and a match with Jun Fukuyama and Mamoru Miyano's roles. He is also an Ultra series actor, having portrayed both Ultraman Ginga and his dark counterpart Dark Lugiel in all of their appearances. And that's just a short list, as the man's voiced multiple characters a year since he started his career in the year 2000. Thus, it's hard to actually get a bead on what makes Yusuke a subversion of Sugita's usual roles, just due to the number of them there are, and other opportunities he's had to be subversive to his typecasting. But from the ones I have seen of Sugita, however, he tends to play characters that are ridiculously over the top in their mania, as best showcased by Joseph Joestar and Dr. Ver, or ones that are just moving and boisterous like Gintoki and Oladin. It's rare that he plays roles that are as reserved and regularly calm or emotionally stunted like Yusuke is, which I think is the key on how it is divergent, as when he's not playing maniacs, a lot of Sugita's credits do place him as the only sane, well-rounded man in the room, which Yusuke is certainly not. That's not necessarily his fault, but it is a difference. Matt Mercer's performance of Yusuke by comparison, oh no, that is for the most part that man's wheelhouse, and he was well cast for the kind of person Yusuke is. As an asset over other party members, as mentioned before, Yusuke can use his artistic talent to both create from scratch or duplicate persona skill cards, allowing any of Ren's persona to learn the skill placed into the card. This talent becomes invaluable when one focuses on leveling up the Strength Arcana, as it takes out the grind for persona fusion grinding if a given persona can just learn the skill they need in order to reach the requirement for the twins' next rank. Though unfortunately Yusuke can only create one skill card a day, so it's best to stock up on the needed skill cards over time. Said skills needed being Mabufu, Frey, Magaru, Tarukaja, Dodge-sai, Dekaja, Tetraja, Masukunda, Samarakarn, and High Counter. Some of these can be obtained from persona itemization, others can be found in the wild. Others Yusuke can create wholesale once your rank is high enough with them. But the ability to not just obtain them, but duplicate these skills to put on persona that can't naturally learn them through persona fusion is the best thing for customizing loadouts how one wants. Like, you can still do such the normal way through persona fusion, but that takes a lot longer. So it is still an asset to have as an alternative, and a warning on which cards to collect getting cloned over time can save you a lot of effort, especially because the persona the associated skills must be put on differ between versions of the game. His Confidant arc revolves around him trying to get out of his creative slump in the wake of learning of Madarame's sins, trying to find a new direction for his life and arts, and struggling with it as with the collapse of Madarame's support. Well, he's not exactly worse off, but his living expenses are now more eating into any funds he might have had for materials. It only being his work with the Phantom Thieves that allows them to earn money off the corpses of shadows that he isn't worse off than he is. And yes, the money we get in the metaverse does end up transitioning into equitable real-world money beyond us trying to resell any treasure items we might obtain. Don't ask us how. In trying to break it, he tries to use the metaverse itself and its wild expression of human emotions as a basis for a new means of presenting his own arts. But as he puts one of his new pieces, which he calls Desire, on display, he finds he's still lacking something. In part thanks to the sabotage Madarame performed that made his art just lacking its fullest potential. It's actually when Yusuke gets into a conversation with an art critic that is hugely detractful of the work that he starts to see what he's missing. And it's what I said before. He has fantastic technique, but without life experience, he cannot embody the emotions of the event he wants to. This art critic is a man named Kawanabe, who is involved with an artist support foundation, permitting those like Yusuke without personal funds or a patron to receive funding to continue to create arts. And Yusuke has a chance to be able to develop a career with his art with their help if he can impress them. But that requires him figuring out what he's missing first. With Ren's help he does, revising the painting he submitted so that it ends up embodying not just one facet of a person, but its common duality. The problem I find with this is, he paired desire, which is ultimately a neutral force and not by default a malicious one, with hope, when one's hope is opposite despair. Hell, one can see hope as a form of desire, when you want something good to happen. And no, as far as I can tell, this isn't a translation error. The Japanese words for desire and hope, yokubo and kibo respectively, were used as the painting's title. But then again, I'm not an art critic, I just know what I like. Regardless, what he injects into the work is more than enough for him to win the next competition he enters, one sponsored by Kawanabe, who agrees to have his organization help support him. Though Yusuke for the time declines their offer, more out of not wanting to become like Madarame than anything. Still, Kawanabe also shares something important about Madarame. As though the man is responsible for abusing his students and let Yusuke's mother die thanks to the temptation to steal her work consuming him, he was not consumed by that malice all of that time. That really was only a recent development. Because before Kawanabe cut ties with him a couple years ago when his self-importance began to consume him, one of the last times he had contact with Madarame was when Madarame called him in a panic, trying to find a clinic to save Yusuke's life when he was deathly ill. This was before the man could in any way profit from anything Yusuke could have made, meaning this compassion towards Yusuke was real. And it was some sick, twisted, distorted bastard who made it so Madarame became empty and could no longer feel that emotion before being consumed by his own vanity. And maybe, had such not happened, maybe Yusuke could have redeemed him, had he not been robbed of his capacity to care. And with Yusuke's passion for painting all he truly cares for, it's hard as well to believe that he is the traitor in our midst, despite the black masked man first being mentioned as the cause behind his former master and foster father's descent into madness. This reflected as well in his arcana, which thematically matches authority and establishment, but in reverse reflects dominance and inflexibility. Yusuke's had a strong foundation for his talent built, and is now building upon that structure himself. Thus he won't let it tumble, like Madarame did, by letting it fall apart like an ill-placed stack of dominoes.
我ながら矛盾してるが、これが心なのだろう。面白い。やはり、これこそが俺の描くべきものだ。きっと、俺に付き合うのは、さぞ面倒だったことと思うが、なぜだろうな。お前は最後まで俺を見捨てないと思った。本当にありがとう。
我は汝、汝は我。汝ここにちぎりを血明の絆へと転生せしめたり。絆は反逆の翼となりて魂のくびきを打ち破らん。今こそ汝、皇帝の究極なる非業に目覚めたり。無尽の力を汝に与えん。
俺に宿るペルソナ、新たな力に目覚めたか。よし、俺そろそろ。
なあ、本当にいいの？うちなんかにはもったいないぜ。
寮で俺だけが抱えているのも、後期の目にさらされるのも嫌でしょうから、何の変哲もない日常をほんの少し彩る。母もきっと同じ選択をするはずです。
そうか。じゃあ預かっといてやるよ。
ごちそうさまでした。